Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Sharon Guynup, an environmental journalist and author who also happens to be a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, and a favorite guest of mine and a favorite former fellow. Sharon joins us to discuss the past, present, and future of global pandemics. Sharon, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Well, you know, I mentioned that you were a favorite of mine during your presidential time at the Wilson Center. And one reason for that, beyond the personal, is that I'm always intrigued when professionals join us who are looking at trend lines and who are way ahead of the headlines. And that's how I think of you, Sharon, because you were talking about the threat of diseases that could spread from the animal kingdom to the human world long before the world was familiar with the term COVID-19. Tell us about the beat that you've been working on for many years and how you could almost see this coming down the hill like a slow motion snowball.
Well, back in, I think 2004 through 2006, I launched a book series for the Wildlife Conservation Society called State of the Wild. And 1/3 of content focused on a specific issue for each volume. The first was hunting in the wildlife trade, and the second was zoonotic disease. So I was talking to veterinarians, epidemiologists, doctors back in 2005, 2006, that were raising the red flag then that the next pandemic was coming, and that because of human alteration to the planet, we were increasing the emergence of new zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases are animals that jump, they're viruses that jump from animals to humans. There also are some bacterial zoonotics. So that was a long time ago. And
it was.
And, you know, there certainly have been plenty of examples since. There's everything from, you know, HIV/AIDS, there's been SARS, MERS, you know, the list is quite long. And what's happened is that the emergence and also the spread of existing zoonotic diseases has really increased since about the 1950s, you know, alongside increased development across the globe.
So when you dig a little deeper on that, what are the circumstances that's causing this increase? When you talk about development, are you talking about humans encroaching on what had previously been wildlife habitats?
Absolutely. And it really has increased the rate of spillover. And, you know, human activities, particularly intrusions into wild landscapes, eating and trading wild animals, bringing people, domestic and wild animals into unnatural proximity, exposes all to pathogens for which they lack immunity. So, you know, you add on top of that international travel and international trade, booming global wildlife trade, both legal and illegal. And we're now spreading a lot of pathogens around the globe.
Are there hotspots, Sharon? Are there places where either there's a cultural preference for exotic animals as sustenance, or other circumstances like that that create the largest areas of risk?
Well, certainly the greatest areas of biodiversity are tropical forests. So, you know, most of the emergences have been in tropical forests, but it's not exclusively the case. This really incredible zoonotic expert, Stephen Osofsky, who's at Cornell, noted that there's really just a handful of ways that we invite infectious pathogens into humanity's living room, which I thought was a great way to frame it. And deforestation is a big one. Again, if you're cutting down tropical forest, you're moving farms, you know, pigs, cows, chickens, humans, dogs, right next to wildlife. At the same time, cutting down forest increases the prevalence of rats, mosquitoes, other vectors that then carry disease. So, it's twofold. It's not only, bringing us in contact to swap microbes, but spreading the vectors as well. And then, illegal and legal wildlife trade is shipping animals across the globe. And, mammal to mammal, we are susceptible to each other's diseases, as we've, seen so well with many of the kinds of diseases I've mentioned, again, from, the AIDS crisis, originated in Central Africa, and it crossed the species line from primates. And it most likely came from hunting and butchering and eating primates. So, that's one example. Nipah virus in Malaysia, it came from bats, and it came from, cutting down rainforest and moving in pig farms. And Nipah jumped from bats to pigs to humans. It's quite deadly. And one thing to note about zoonotic disease is that there is no cure for any of them.
A vaccine to maybe take the edge off, but no cure.
Yes.
Yeah. So as if the storm that you just described isn't perfect enough, let me pile on, because what we also are seeing is not just humans on the move, encroaching in ways that are creating risks, but also as a result of climate change, animals on the move because of a changing landscape and different habitats now being expanded because of warming. Are these circumstances overlapping in ways that are creating enhanced risk?
Absolutely. And one of the largest enhanced risks is that of vectors that are expanding their territories. Ticks are surviving longer into the winter if they're dying at all. They're spreading into new areas. Mosquitoes, and there's so many diseases that they spread. So the vectors are a big, big issue. Dengue is moving far north. Zika is moving far north. Malaria is moving. So even existing diseases are infecting new regions.
Sharon, I think I know the answer to this question, but I feel compelled to ask it. Is there any way for us to predict where and what's coming next? I think back to when we were hearing reports of this strange flu-like symptoms in Wuhan, China, and within in a matter of weeks or months, we were talking about cases in Seattle, Washington, and the emergence of a global pandemic. I'm wondering, as you were watching that story unfold, was it a sort of reaction of, well, of course this is happening. This is exactly what we've been warned about? How do you process this? And is there any way to have a finger on the pulse, to have some sense of where we need to be watching most acutely?
Yes and no. Most of the money at this point looking at zoonotic disease is looking into surveillance, and particularly in the tropics, and possible treatments, vaccines, which are all really important. But, the rate of spillover is increasing. Up to 75% of new infectious human diseases are zoonotic and originate in the tropics. There's a vast pool of unknown viruses. Peter Daszak at EcoHealth Alliance in New York said there were possibly more than 1.6 million unknown viruses out there. And of those, 600,000 to 800,000 could potentially infect humans. So surveillance is only going to go so far. And there has been a big push for at least 15 years now from epidemiologists, from doctors, from veterinarians, and others to expand our notion of health to a One Health perspective, which looks at human health, wildlife health, and ecosystem health as a whole, and realizes that there's certain areas that incursions involve risk. So maybe a dam, maybe a mine, maybe new roads, maybe logging. certain kinds of development, farming. Perhaps it's more protective to not take on those development projects. And, many have proposed that be part of an environmental assessment to include, the risk and the economics. Because, prevention will not only save lives, it'll save a great deal of money.
What's your set? I'm sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
I was just going to say that, in a normal year without a global pandemic, there are more than 1 billion zoonotic disease cases, all kinds of diseases. And that's without a pandemic like we're still experiencing. And that kills roughly 1 million people. In 1998, the Nipah outbreak cost 500 million. In 2003, the SARS outbreak cost 40 billion. A US congressional report projects the cost of the current COVID pandemic from 2020 through 2025 at $28 trillion. So, this is not just a huge loss of life. There's massive economic impacts. And, this COVID pandemic sparked a global recession. It thrust more than 95 million people into extreme poverty. There's huge costs here. So this isn't just about saving animals. It's also human health, but it's also economies, national security. It's a big, important issue that needs much more attention.
Yeah, and those impacts that you described, they're not over, right? We're now seeing the almost belated impact on supply chains in a way that we're not anywhere close to being out of the woods. I want to ask you about lessons learned and if you're seeing any evidence that they are being learned and that behavior is changing. Much was made initially in assumptions about where COVID-19 came from, about wildlife, bats in particular in wild markets in China, and people saying this has to stop. What do we know about whether or not there has been an adjustment based on what the world has been through with this pandemic for now going on 2 years?
There has been a little, but there hasn't been enough. So not long after the pandemic hit, China closed down its wet markets. Now, a wet market may be just a vegetable market, right? I mean, that's kind of a broad term, but some wet markets also sell live wildlife stacked on top of each other in cages, species from all over the world. So really not a hygienic or, microbially safe environment. It really petri dish for these diseases to emerge. So the wildlife markets, which again, some legally traded species, some illegally trafficked species. So we're not just looking at wildlife trafficking. It's, there's legal wildlife trade across the globe, but it too presents a threat. So China closed down those markets. They also, China back in the 1990s had pushed wildlife farming as a way to pull rural farmers out of poverty. And, that really moved forward a wildlife market, for fur, for traditional Chinese medicine. The Chinese government shut down any farms that were being used strictly for food consumption. So that was a big thing, because at that point there were 68 species that could be farmed for commercial use. However, they did make an exemption for traditional medicine and for fashion. So some of the species that are still being farmed present a disease risk. Things like civet cats, which are thought to maybe have been the intermediate host for SARS. Raccoon dogs were known to transmit coronaviruses. So, there's not enough being done there. There's still many wildlife markets in many parts of the world. And some of it is for traditional medicine, some of it is for fur, some of it is for bushmeat. And bushmeat does also provide important nutrition for some rural and local people. So I think there's some sensitivity there. I think it really comes down to the species and whether it's a commercial market or whether it's feeding local people. So I think there's a lot of considerations, and development is a big one. So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question.
No, it does. It paints a very complex picture, but I expected nothing less, right? There's no silver bullet or simple solution here. It's
Right.
such a matrix of activity. And I do want to tell our viewers that don't be alarmed for Sharon's health. Those noises you hear in the background is her
Sorry.
dog. No, no, I just know people will hear it and wonder what's happening. So I just wanted
Not
to
just a
let
dog,
him
it's
know.
a puppy.
A puppy, yes, a playful puppy who poses no threat to our guest. Quite the opposite. Sharon, one final thought, and it's about the continuing mystery about the exact origins of COVID-19. We make a lot of assumptions, and scientists have a pretty good sense of where it may have come from. But how important is it to know precisely as we work through this, as we try to create guardrails to prevent it from happening again?
Well, let's face it, biosafety in research is important. There has been some conjecture that it may have escaped from a lab that did study zoonotic diseases in Wuhan. Biosafety is key. There's a lot of very dangerous things being studied in labs around the world. However, the issues are far larger. So I think we really need to address the kinds of human behavior that are facilitating both the emergence and the spread of these diseases. I mean, think about it. Back in medieval times, if you were infected with something, say bubonic plague, you might get on a ship and 2 months later you would arrive where you were going. So you would already be sick. People would know you were sick. Quarantine was introduced along with bubonic plague. At this point, you could be infected with COVID, jump a plane, go through a number of connecting hubs in major cities, be in contact with many, many people, and you wouldn't even know you were sick for a week or two after you arrive. Now with COVID, we have some protocols now, so that's less likely now with, mask requirements and whatever in travel. But my point is that we can so easily spread diseases around the globe at this point that it really is a different ballgame.
At supersonic speed almost. And what you describe is, as we've discussed in the past, microbes and germs don't need passports and don't understand national boundaries.
Or species boundaries.
Or species boundaries.
They jump the Darwinian divide.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sharon, your work continues to be vital, and thank you for your ongoing work. And for those of you interested, we link to a lot of Sharon's pieces at wilsoncenter.org, and you can find her work with National Geographic, New York Times, and elsewhere. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for another very informative discussion.
Thank you so much, John. Have a great day.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.